One man stood quietly near a VIP entrance for less than 3 minutes. And somehow that was enough for an entire terminal to get the story wrong. Marcus Bennett adjusted the strap of his leather travel bag and looked through the tall glass windows overlooking the airport runway. Aircraft moved steadily beneath the afternoon sun, while travelers rushed through the terminal carrying coffee cups, rolling suitcases, and last-minute worries. Marcus appeared completely ordinary among them. He wore a dark charcoal blazer, a light blue dress shirt, and simple travel slacks. Nothing about him suggested wealth. Nothing about him announced influence. That was exactly how he preferred it. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we are glad you are here. Now, back to Marcus Bennett. He checked the time on his watch. His meeting was scheduled later that afternoon, but he had arrived early as he always did. Years of building companies had taught him that punctuality was one of the simplest forms of respect. A private vehicle was supposed to meet him near a secured executive entrance connected to the airport administration wing. Until then, all he had to do was wait. Marcus stepped to the side of the concourse near a marked access corridor reserved for authorized personnel and invited guests. He remained several feet away from the actual doorway, careful not to block anyone. Airport employees passed by without incident. Some nodded politely. Others barely noticed him. Marcus was perfectly comfortable with that. He removed his phone and reviewed a few notes connected to a transportation investment proposal. The airport he stood inside was preparing for major upgrades over the next several years. New terminals, modernized passenger services, expanded infrastructure. It was the type of project that could reshape an entire region. Marcus had spent months studying the opportunity. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and glanced around the terminal. Families hurried toward departure gates. Business travelers typed rapidly on laptops. Flight announcements echoed from overhead speakers. Everything seemed ordinary. Then something changed. Across the concourse, a security supervisor named Derek Coleman noticed him. Derek had worked airport security for more than a decade. Experience had trained him to pay attention to unusual details. Most days, that instinct helped him solve problems before they started. Today, however, it would lead him somewhere very different. Derek observed Marcus standing near the executive access area. He slowed his pace. His eyes moved from Marcus to the secured entrance and back again. From his perspective, something did not fit. The man appeared relaxed, unhurried, comfortable. Yet Derek did not recognize him. The supervisor continued watching from a distance. Marcus remained focused on the runway outside, completely unaware of the attention he was attracting. A few airport employees passed through the restricted entrance using identification badges. Marcus never attempted to approach the door. He simply waited. But sometimes assumptions begin long before actions do. Derek's curiosity slowly transformed into concern. Concern transformed into suspicion. Nearby, travelers noticed the security supervisor watching someone. Naturally, their attention followed his gaze. Within minutes, several strangers who had never met Marcus found themselves looking in his direction. None of them knew who he was. None of them knew why he was there. Yet the presence of a security officer was enough to create questions. Marcus continued waiting calmly, unaware that a story was already forming around him. A story built entirely from appearances, incomplete information, and assumptions. The strange part was that the most important person involved had not spoken a single word. And as Derek finally started walking toward him, the misunderstanding that would soon capture the attention of an entire terminal was only beginning. Derek Coleman slowed his pace as he approached the man standing near the executive access corridor. Years of working airport security had trained him to trust his instincts, and at that moment his instincts were telling him that something about the situation deserved closer attention. Marcus Bennett remained unaware of the attention gathering around him. He stood quietly near the window, watching aircraft move across the runway while waiting for the scheduled pickup he had been told would arrive shortly. To him, the afternoon was unfolding exactly as planned. To Derek, it looked different. The security supervisor stopped a few feet away and studied Marcus carefully. He noticed the expensive watch, though it was understated. He noticed the calm posture. Most importantly, he noticed how comfortable Marcus seemed standing near a secured area. In Derek's mind, that comfort raised questions. "Sir," Derek said. Marcus turned immediately, and offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon. May I ask what you were doing in this area?" The question was professional, but nearby travelers heard it and immediately became interested. Marcus answered calmly, "I am waiting for someone." Derek glanced toward the secured entrance. "Someone who works here?" "You could say that." The answer was truthful, but it did not provide the certainty Derek wanted. His concern deepened. Nearby passengers began paying attention more openly now. Whenever security stopped to question someone, people naturally became curious. Marcus noticed the attention but remained completely relaxed. "Do you have business in this section of the airport?" Derek asked. "Yes." "Can you explain the nature of that business?" Marcus smiled politely. "I have a scheduled meeting." Derek waited for additional details. None came. Marcus was not being difficult. He simply saw no reason to volunteer information nobody had requested directly. Unfortunately, the lack of detail only increased Derek's suspicion. The security supervisor looked toward the executive access entrance again. That doorway was frequently used by airline executives, government officials, investors, and authorized guests. Most visitors arriving there checked in through established channels. Marcus appeared to be standing alone, waiting, calm, unbothered. The situation did not fit Derek's expectations. "Do you have documentation related to this meeting?" Derek asked. Marcus reached into his jacket and produced identification along with a digital invitation stored on his phone. Derek reviewed both. The documents appeared legitimate, yet something continued bothering him. He could not explain exactly why. The feeling simply remained. Several travelers nearby had now stopped pretending not to watch. A family seated near the windows exchanged quiet comments. A businessman closed his laptop halfway. Two airport employees slowed their pace while passing through the concourse. Attention was growing. Derek felt it. Marcus felt it too. The difference was that Marcus did not seem concerned. "I am going to need a moment to verify this information," Derek said. "Of course." Once again, the response was calm. No argument. No frustration. No complaint. Derek stepped aside and began making calls through his radio network. While he spoke, passengers continued observing from a distance. Human nature was already doing what it always does. People were creating explanations before facts arrived. Some assumed Marcus had entered a restricted area. Others assumed he had ignored airport procedures. Nobody actually knew. Yet uncertainty has a way of inviting conclusions. Marcus simply returned his attention to the runway outside. His patience confused several people watching. Most individuals questioned by security became nervous or defensive. Marcus looked like a man waiting for a delayed lunch reservation. Across the airport, Operations Manager Emily Ross was reviewing executive arrival schedules connected to a confidential airline development meeting. Her desk contained guest lists, transportation arrangements, and coordination notes involving senior leadership. One particular name appeared several times throughout the afternoon itinerary: Marcus Bennett. At that exact moment, she had no idea that the man listed on those documents was standing inside the terminal, surrounded by growing suspicion. Back near the executive corridor, Derek ended another radio conversation. The answers he received had not resolved his concerns. In fact, they had introduced a new phrase into the situation. A phrase he would soon repeat aloud. A phrase that would instantly change how everyone around Marcus viewed him. And once those words entered the air, the misunderstanding surrounding one quiet businessman would become far more public than anyone expected. The atmosphere around Marcus Bennett changed the moment Derek Coleman lowered his radio and looked back toward him. The security supervisor had spent several minutes attempting to verify information through internal channels. Instead of receiving clarity, he had encountered uncertainty. And uncertainty inside an airport environment often triggered caution. Unfortunately, caution has a way of looking very different to people watching from the outside. Derek walked back toward Marcus while several nearby travelers quietly followed the interaction with growing interest. "Sir," Derek said. Marcus turned from the window and faced him calmly. "Yes." Derek chose his next words carefully. "At this time, we are treating this as a potential security concern until additional verification can be completed." The phrase landed with immediate force. Security concern. Several nearby passengers heard it clearly. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Within seconds, the atmosphere shifted. Marcus noticed the reaction around him, but remained composed. "I understand," he replied. Derek seemed surprised by the response. Most people reacted strongly when associated with language like that. Marcus simply nodded. How long do you expect the verification process to take? I cannot say yet. Then I will wait. The answer was calm enough to make Derek pause for a moment. Yet the phrase he had already spoken continued spreading through the terminal. People rarely remember details. They remember labels. And the label had now entered the crowd. A woman sitting near a charging station quietly gathered her belongings and moved farther away. A businessman looked toward Marcus and then toward the security supervisor. Two travelers whispered to each other while glancing repeatedly in his direction. None of them knew anything beyond two words. Security concern. That was enough. Marcus remained standing exactly where he had been before. The only difference was how people looked at him now. Derek noticed the reactions as well. Part of him felt uncomfortable. He had not intended to create a public scene. Yet from his perspective, procedures existed for a reason. If there was uncertainty, it needed to be addressed. Across the airport, Emily Ross continued reviewing executive arrival schedules connected to the confidential development meeting. Several transportation updates had arrived throughout the afternoon. One particular notation caught her attention. VIP guest arriving through executive access entrance. Marcus Bennett. Emily frowned slightly. The name was familiar because it appeared repeatedly throughout project documents connected to the airline's future infrastructure plans. She opened another file and confirmed what she already suspected. Marcus Bennett was scheduled to meet with some of the most senior leadership figures associated with the airport and airline. Back near the terminal windows, Marcus checked the time. His pickup should have arrived by now. Yet he showed no frustration. Years of leadership had taught him something simple. Panic rarely improves a situation. Patience often does. The crowd around him, however, interpreted his calmness in different ways. Some viewed it as confidence. Others viewed it as suspicious. Human beings often see what they expect to see. Derek remained nearby while additional verification requests moved through internal channels. Every minute that passed attracted more attention. The situation had become public without anyone officially announcing it. Travelers arriving from nearby gates slowed down to observe. Airport employees exchanged curious glances. Marcus had become the center of a story nobody actually understood. A young traveler seated near the window finally spoke. Are you okay? Marcus smiled warmly. I am fine. You seem very calm. Marcus nodded. There is no reason not to be. The traveler seemed puzzled by the answer. Most people standing under public scrutiny would have appeared nervous. Marcus looked like a man waiting for a delayed appointment. Across the operations center, Emily suddenly stopped reading. Her eyes returned to the executive arrival notes. A second document attached to the file contained photographs of several high-profile guests expected that day. She opened it. A moment later, her expression changed. The photograph displayed on her screen matched the man currently standing inside the terminal. Emily immediately reached for her phone. Meanwhile, at the concourse, Derek remained convinced he was handling a routine security matter. The crowd remained convinced they were watching someone under investigation. Marcus remained the only person who appeared completely at peace. And several floors away, a single file had just revealed a truth that was about to challenge every assumption made inside the terminal. The longer Marcus Bennett remained near the executive access corridor, the more the terminal seemed to organize itself around a story that nobody had verified. What began as curiosity had evolved into something stronger. People were no longer simply observing. They were reaching conclusions. The phrase Derek Coleman had used earlier continued echoing through quiet conversations. Security concern. 2 words. That was all it took. Travelers arriving from nearby gates noticed the attention and immediately assumed something unusual had happened. Some slowed their pace to look. Others glanced briefly before continuing on their way. A few chose seats that offered a better view of the unfolding situation. Marcus stood calmly through all of it. He neither encouraged attention nor reacted to it. His patience was becoming one of the strangest parts of the situation. Most people facing public scrutiny felt a need to explain themselves. Marcus seemed completely comfortable allowing time to do the work instead. Derek remained nearby, maintaining a professional distance while continuing to monitor the situation. From his perspective, caution remained justified. He still lacked answers. The information available to him did not fully explain why Marcus had been waiting near the executive entrance. Until those answers arrived, he believed procedure required vigilance. Yet even Derek began noticing something unusual. Marcus never contradicted himself, never appeared nervous, never attempted to leave, never displayed frustration. Everything about his behavior suggested someone who expected the truth to arrive eventually. Nearby, a businessman closed his laptop and shook his head. If security is involved, there must be a reason, he quietly told another traveler. The second man nodded. They usually do not stop people without cause. Neither knew Marcus. Neither knew Derek. Yet certainty spread anyway. Human beings often trust confidence more than evidence. Marcus overheard none of the comments directly, but he recognized the atmosphere. He had encountered similar situations throughout his career. Not identical situations, but similar patterns. A small misunderstanding. A public audience. Assumptions arriving before facts. He looked through the glass windows toward a departing aircraft and remained perfectly calm. Several rows away, a young woman continued watching him. Eventually she approached. "Sir, can I ask you something?" Marcus smiled politely. "Of course. How are you staying so calm?" Marcus considered the question. Because panic does not improve understanding. The answer surprised her. Most people would be upset. Most people probably have reasons for feeling upset. And you do not. Marcus smiled. "I have reasons for being patient." The young woman returned to her seat thinking about the response. Others who overheard the exchange seemed equally puzzled. The man at the center of the controversy sounded less like a threat and more like a teacher. Several floors above the terminal, Emily Ross was moving quickly through the operations office. The photograph she had discovered left no room for doubt. She had verified the guest list twice, verified the transportation schedule twice, verified the executive meeting agenda twice. Every document led to the same conclusion. Marcus Bennett was not an unauthorized visitor. He was one of the most important guests expected that day. Emily immediately began making calls. The reactions she received were immediate. Names she rarely contacted personally were suddenly asking questions. Senior administrators requested updates. Managers checked schedules. Information started moving rapidly through channels that rarely activated without good reason. Back in the terminal, none of that was visible yet. The crowd continued building its own version of events. Derek continued believing he was handling a routine security matter. Marcus continued waiting. Yet the balance of the story had already started shifting. The truth was moving toward the terminal much faster than anyone realized. And somewhere beyond the airport entrance, preparations were quietly being made for the arrival of people whose presence would soon change everything the crowd thought it knew about the man standing calmly beside the window. Marcus Bennett remained exactly where he was while the terminal continued creating stories about him. The attention no longer came in brief glances. People were openly watching now. Travelers passing through the concourse slowed down when they noticed the security presence. Some paused long enough to ask quiet questions. Others simply observed from a distance. The strange part was that Marcus seemed entirely unaffected by any of it. He stood near the windows overlooking the runway with the same calm expression he had worn from the beginning. Derek Coleman noticed it too. The longer the situation continued, the more unusual Marcus appeared. Most people placed under scrutiny eventually became frustrated. Some demanded explanations. Others demanded supervisors. Marcus did neither. "Do you need anything while we continue verification?" Derek finally asked. Marcus smiled politely. "No, thank you. You are being very patient." Patience is usually less expensive than panic. Derek almost smiled at the response before catching himself. Despite his concerns, he could not ignore how composed Marcus remained. Nearby passengers overheard portions of the conversation. Several seemed surprised by Marcus's tone. He did not sound defensive. He did not sound angry. He sounded like someone who had experienced challenges before and learned how to navigate them without emotion. Across the airport, Emily Ross had already elevated the situation through multiple administrative channels. The reactions she received were unlike anything she expected. Executives responded almost immediately. Questions moved rapidly through departments. Transportation schedules were checked. Meeting agendas were reviewed. Names were confirmed. Every answer pointed toward the same conclusion. Marcus Bennett was not simply attending a meeting. He was one of the most significant external partners connected to a future airline investment initiative worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Back in the terminal, however, none of that information had reached the crowd. Assumptions still dominated the narrative. A businessman sitting nearby shook his head while speaking quietly to another traveler. Security does not usually stay with someone this long unless something serious is happening. The second traveler nodded. That is what I was thinking. Marcus heard neither comment directly. If he had, he likely would not have responded anyway. Years of leadership had taught him a valuable lesson. People often create explanations when facts are unavailable. Correcting every assumption becomes impossible. Sometimes the truth simply needs time to arrive. Derek received another radio update and listened carefully. The information provided little clarity. Procedures continued. Verification continued. Waiting continued. Yet something about the entire situation felt increasingly unusual. Marcus showed none of the behaviors Derek normally associated with genuine security concerns. There was no nervousness, no inconsistency, no attempt to leave, no attempt to argue, only patience. The contradiction began creating doubt. At that exact moment, Emily received confirmation from senior administration. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the message. A transportation adjustment had been authorized immediately. Executive reception plans were being changed. Someone important had decided not to wait for Marcus to arrive. Instead, they were coming to him. Emily looked out toward the terminal through the operations office window and understood what that meant. The misunderstanding unfolding downstairs was about to collide with reality. Meanwhile, Marcus checked the time once more. His scheduled pickup was late, but he remained unconcerned. Derek remained nearby. The crowd remained convinced they understood the situation. Yet beyond the airport entrance, preparations were already underway for an arrival nobody inside the terminal expected. And when that arrival finally appeared, every assumption built throughout the afternoon would begin collapsing one by one. While passengers continued watching Marcus Bennett from a distance, the first cracks in the misunderstanding were beginning to appear behind the scenes. Emily Ross moved quickly through the operations office, carrying a printed packet that she had reviewed 3 separate times. Every page confirmed the same thing. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. The man currently standing under suspicion in the terminal was not an unauthorized visitor. He was one of the most important guests expected at the airport that day. Emily stopped outside a conference room and immediately briefed 2 senior administrators. Their reactions mirrored her own. Surprise first, concern second, then urgency. One administrator opened the meeting schedule and stared at the highlighted entry. Marcus Bennett, strategic investor, executive guest, private consultation attendee. The list continued. Another manager checked transportation arrangements and frowned. Has he been escorted yet? Emily shook her head. No. Security is still verifying him. Silence filled the room for a moment. The implications were obvious. Downstairs, dozens of people were watching a situation unfold that should never have happened. Back in the terminal, Marcus remained calm. He stood near the windows overlooking the runway while aircraft taxied across the tarmac. To anyone observing from a distance, he looked like a traveler waiting for a delayed flight. Only Marcus knew he was waiting for a meeting that could influence the future direction of several major transportation projects. Derek Coleman continued monitoring the situation. Although he remained professional, uncertainty was beginning to affect him. The longer he observed Marcus, the less the situation resembled the security concerns he typically handled. Marcus never contradicted himself, never attempted to leave, never displayed anxiety. Most importantly, he never acted like someone trying to avoid scrutiny. Instead, he seemed remarkably comfortable with the process. Sir, Derek said after approaching again, I appreciate your cooperation. Marcus smiled. You are doing your job. The answer caught Derek off guard. There was no sarcasm, no frustration, just sincerity. Not everyone sees it that way, Derek admitted. That is usually because they are focused on the inconvenience, Marcus replied. I try to focus on the outcome. Derek nodded thoughtfully before stepping away once more. Nearby passengers overheard parts of the conversation. Their reactions became more conflicted. The man they had quietly labeled as suspicious did not behave the way they expected. Several travelers exchanged uncertain looks. Others continued holding on to their assumptions. It is often difficult for people to abandon a story once they have accepted it. Upstairs, Emily received another message. This one came directly from executive leadership. Her eyes widened as she read it. Transportation plans had changed completely. The scheduled pickup was no longer necessary. Someone from the highest levels of the airline had decided to come personally. Emily immediately understood the significance. This was no routine guest arrival. Very few visitors received that level of attention. She gathered her materials and headed toward the terminal. Meanwhile, Marcus checked his watch again. The delay was becoming noticeable, yet his patience never wavered. Years earlier, he had learned that frustration rarely accelerated reality. Events unfolded when they were ready. Around him, however, tension continued growing. The crowd sensed that something unusual was happening. Employees were receiving calls. Managers were moving through the terminal with greater urgency. Security personnel were communicating more frequently. The atmosphere had changed. Derek noticed it too. He received another radio transmission and listened carefully. This time his expression shifted. The information was incomplete, but it was enough to tell him that senior leadership was suddenly involved. That almost never happened during routine verification matters. For the first time all afternoon, Derek began questioning his own assumptions. Across the terminal entrance, activity was quietly increasing. Staff members were repositioning themselves. Communication lines were buzzing. People with authority were preparing for an arrival. None of the passengers understood why. Marcus understood slightly more than they did, but even he did not know exactly what was coming. One thing was certain. The truth that had remained hidden all afternoon was moving rapidly toward the terminal. And when it finally arrived, the story everyone thought they understood would begin changing faster than anyone imagined. The first sign that something was changing appeared near the main entrance of the terminal. Most passengers did not notice it immediately. Marcus Bennett certainly did not. He remained near the windows overlooking the runway, calmly waiting while airport activity continued around him. Derek Coleman stood several yards away, monitoring the situation with growing uncertainty. The confidence he had felt earlier was beginning to fade. Too many unusual things were happening behind the scenes. Too many managers were suddenly involved. Too many radio conversations seemed connected to one quiet man who had done nothing more than stand patiently and wait. Then several airport employees near the entrance straightened their posture almost simultaneously. A few security personnel adjusted their positions. Others exchanged brief looks. The reaction was subtle, but it was there. Something important was arriving. Across the terminal, Emily Ross emerged from a secured hallway and immediately scanned the concourse. Her eyes found Marcus within seconds. Relief crossed her face. He was still there. She checked her phone and received another confirmation message. The arrival she had been waiting for was less than a minute away. Nearby passengers sensed the shift in atmosphere. Travelers who had been casually observing the situation now watched more carefully. Even those who knew nothing about airports could tell when staff members suddenly became more attentive. The terminal entrance doors opened. A sleek black SUV rolled slowly into the executive arrival zone outside the glass walls. The vehicle immediately attracted attention. It was not unusual for executives to visit airports, but this particular arrival seemed different. Employees were reacting with a level of urgency rarely seen during ordinary visits. Several people in business attire moved toward the entrance. Others stopped what they were doing entirely. Derek noticed it immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly. He had worked at the airport long enough to recognize executive protocol. Whatever was happening, it involved someone important. Very important. The black SUV came to a smooth stop. The terminal seemed to hold its breath. Passengers near the windows stood to get a better look. Conversations quieted. Even Marcus finally glanced toward the entrance after noticing the unusual activity. The driver exited first. Then another individual stepped out and briefly surveyed the area. Moments later, the rear passenger door opened. Emily Ross felt her pulse quicken. Several managers exchanged nervous glances. Derek stared through the glass, trying to understand what he was seeing. The arrival was far above the level of attention he expected. Yet nobody moved toward Marcus. Not yet. The crowd watched as airport leadership began gathering near the entrance. Employees who normally carried themselves casually now looked exceptionally focused. A businessman seated nearby whispered to another traveler. "Who is that?" The second man shook his head. "I do not know, but this looks important." Marcus remained calm. If he was surprised, he did not show it. Years of experience had taught him not to react before understanding the full picture. Still, even he recognized that something unusual was unfolding. Emily received one final message and smiled. The confusion that had dominated the afternoon was about to end. Derek's radio crackled again. This time the voice on the other end sounded different. More formal. More urgent. The instructions were brief. Maintain position. Senior leadership is arriving. Derek lowered the radio slowly. Senior leadership. The words echoed in his mind. He looked at Marcus, then toward the black SUV, then back at Marcus again. For the first time all afternoon, a possibility entered his thoughts that he had never seriously considered before. What if the man standing quietly beside the window was not connected to a problem? What if he was the reason everyone important was suddenly arriving? The answer had not arrived yet, but it was walking closer with every passing second. And as the door of the black SUV remained open and a powerful figure prepared to enter the terminal, the assumptions that had defined the entire afternoon were only moments away from being challenged in front of everyone watching. The terminal fell noticeably quieter as the figure from the black SUV stepped through the entrance doors. Even passengers who had no idea who he was could sense his importance immediately. Airport employees straightened their posture. Managers moved closer. Conversations softened into whispers. The man carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people every day. William Grant, president of the airline, entered the terminal surrounded by only a small group of executives. He did not appear rushed. He did not appear concerned. Yet there was purpose in every step he took. Derek Coleman watched from several yards away. His confusion deepened almost immediately. William did not stop to speak with airport managers first. He did not greet operations personnel. He did not pause near the entrance. Instead, his eyes moved directly across the terminal until they found one person, Marcus Bennett. For a moment, the entire sequence felt unreal. The president of the airline smiled the instant he recognized Marcus. Then he began walking straight toward him. Emily Ross exhaled quietly. She had known this was coming, but seeing it happen in person carried a completely different impact. Nearby passengers followed William's movement with their eyes. They expected him to approach airport leadership. Instead, he crossed the concourse toward the same man who had spent the afternoon under suspicion. Marcus noticed him approaching and smiled warmly. The expression was not one of surprise. It was the expression of someone greeting a familiar colleague. The crowd sensed it immediately. Something was wrong with the story they had built. William reached Marcus and extended his hand. "Marcus, I am sorry for the delay." Marcus shook his hand firmly. "No problem at all, William. These things happen." The terminal seemed to freeze. Several passengers stared openly. Derek felt his stomach tighten. The airline president knew Marcus personally. Not casually. Not professionally from a distance. Personally. William continued speaking with genuine respect. "I appreciate your patience. We have been looking forward to this meeting for months." Marcus smiled. "I have been looking forward to it as well." More pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. Managers standing nearby exchanged glances. Travelers who had spent the afternoon assuming Marcus was a problem now struggled to reconcile that assumption with reality. William turned toward Emily. "Has everything been prepared?" "Yes, sir." "Excellent." Then he looked back at Marcus. "The executive team is ready whenever you are." Executive team. The phrase echoed through the surrounding crowd. Derek stood motionless. He remembered every question he had asked, every assumption he had made, every moment he had spent treating Marcus as a potential concern rather than an honored guest. William finally noticed the unusual atmosphere around them. His expression shifted slightly. "Is everything all right?" Emily carefully explained what had happened. She kept her description professional and factual. The misunderstanding, the verification process, the public attention, the delay. William listened quietly. With each sentence, the realization became more visible on the faces around him. When Emily finished, William nodded slowly. Then he looked directly at Marcus. "You handled it the same way you always do." Marcus laughed softly. There was no reason to make things more complicated. The simplicity of the response somehow made the moment even more powerful. Here stood a man influential enough to be personally welcomed by the president of the airline. Yet he had spent the entire afternoon cooperating without once mentioning who he was. No threats, no demands, no attempt to impress anyone. Just patience. William turned toward Derek and extended a hand. "I appreciate your commitment to security." Derek shook it, though his thoughts were racing. William then added something unexpected. "Marcus is one of our most important strategic partners. The projects we are discussing today will influence this airport for years. Silence followed. The crowd finally understood. The man they had watched with suspicion was not a risk to the airport. He was helping shape its future. And as that realization spread through the terminal, the assumptions that had dominated the entire afternoon began collapsing one after another. For several moments after William Grant revealed Marcus Bennett's role, nobody seemed to know what to say. The terminal that had been filled with whispers throughout the afternoon suddenly became very quiet. Travelers who had confidently formed opinions now found themselves replaying everything they had witnessed. The man they had viewed as a potential problem had never raised his voice, never argued, never demanded special treatment. In fact, the only people who had changed throughout the afternoon were the observers. Marcus had remained exactly the same from beginning to end. William stood beside him while airport managers gathered nearby. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Earlier, Marcus had stood alone near the windows while people quietly questioned his presence. Now some of the most influential figures connected to the airport and airline were standing beside him with visible respect. Derek Coleman felt the weight of the realization more than most. He approached Marcus slowly. The confidence that had guided him through the earlier hours had been replaced by reflection. "Mr. Bennett," he said. Marcus turned toward him immediately. "Yes." Derek took a breath. "I owe you an apology." The words were sincere. There was no pressure from management, no public demand, just honesty. "I made assumptions before I had all the facts." Marcus listened quietly. "I believed I was following procedure, but I also realized there were moments when I should have asked more questions instead of relying on conclusions." Marcus smiled warmly. "You were trying to protect the airport." Derek nodded. "That was the intention. Then learn from the experience and move forward." Derek seemed surprised by the answer. There was no anger, no desire to embarrass him, no attempt to make the moment larger than it needed to be. Marcus simply accepted the apology and offered dignity in return. Several people nearby witnessed the exchange. The reaction was immediate. Respect for Marcus deepened even further. Many people could handle success gracefully. Far fewer could handle misunderstanding with the same level of composure. William watched the interaction and smiled. It was exactly the response he expected. Across the terminal, passengers slowly returned to their routines. Yet many continued glancing toward Marcus. The story they would remember later would not be about airport security. It would not be about executive meetings. It would not even be about the president of the airline arriving in a black SUV. The story they would remember was the difference between perception and reality. Emily Ross joined the group and confirmed that the executive meeting was ready to begin. William nodded. "We should get moving." Marcus adjusted his travel bag and prepared to leave. Before walking away, he looked once more toward the terminal where so much had unfolded during a single afternoon. The crowd had changed. The atmosphere had changed. The understanding had changed. All because the facts had finally arrived. As they began walking toward the executive corridor, William smiled. "You handled that better than most people would have." Marcus laughed softly. "People see a moment. They rarely see the full story." "That is true." Marcus nodded. "The challenge is remembering that every person has a story you cannot see." Those words lingered with everyone who heard them. Derek remained standing in the concourse long after Marcus disappeared through the secured entrance. He thought about the assumptions that had seemed so reasonable earlier. He thought about how easily appearances had influenced perception. Most of all, he thought about how different the outcome could have been if Marcus had responded with anger instead of patience. The afternoon left behind a lesson far more valuable than anyone expected. Security can identify risks. Procedures can identify concerns. Systems can identify irregularities. But none of those things can fully identify a person. That requires something else: time, understanding, and the willingness to look beyond first impressions. As the executive doors closed behind Marcus and the terminal slowly returned to normal, one truth remained impossible to ignore. A label can shape a moment. A reputation can shape a career. But character reveals itself long before either one. And on that afternoon, character was the one thing that never changed.